And now, a special motorcycle weather report from Progressive.
Well, today you can expect lots of cloud cover with 0% chance of raining on your parade because you'll be riding your motorcycle vroom vroom. That rumbling low-pressure system beneath you should give way to a relaxing commute and the sudden urge to take the scenic route everywhere you go because, dagnabbit, you're having fun out there. That's your forecast. Back to you.
This has been a special motorcycle weather report from Progressive, where every day's a beautiful day to ride with coverage from America's #1 motorcycle insurer. Get a quote today and see what you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates.
Did you know Nissan EVs have traveled 8 billion miles? Just a quick trip to Pluto and back. And what did we learn along the way? Well, that an EV can take on the world, like the Nissan Leaf. It can move racing forward and take your breath away, like the all-new Nissan Ariya. We learned to make EVs that electrify. 8 billion miles driven by Leaf owners globally since 2010. 2023 Ariya has limited availability. All-wheel drive expected availability early 2023, subject to change.
I think you're full of, I think I'm full of shit. I was so full of, yeah, we're so full of. I think I'm full of, I think you're full of, I think we're full of shit.
Welcome to So Very Wrong About Games, a board gaming podcast about board games. This week, 1 hour earlier. Dun, dun, dun.
Well, according to the sun. According to everybody else, it's at the normal time.
I'm here with my great friend and co-host Mark. How are you this week?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you, Walker?
Always good.
I'm glad to hear that.
Like he says, my name is Michael Walker, and we are going to do what we normally do. We're going to talk about the games we played this week. A very short news segment because it doesn't matter. And then the main review of the week, which is Mille Fiori by Reiner Knizia. Mark, what did you play this week?
I went back to Votes for Women. This is the time by Tory Brown and Fourth Circle Games, the card-driven historical game about the suffrage movement in the United States of America, leading to the passage of the constitutional amendment that gave women the right to vote. And I played it solo because the solo mode was particularly recommended, the Oppobot, as it is called. I say this all the time. What I'm looking for in a solitaire version is an easily applied game that feels like the main game itself. And so frequently they fail on one or both of those criteria. The Oppobot was a delight. It's pull an event card, it either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, the bot does a campaign action based purely on tables that are printed on the board. You just roll a die for what region they are, the regions are numbered, and you roll a die for what state they're going to pump influence in, the states are numbered, and that's it. Now, granted, near the end of the game, you end up rolling quite a bit because many of the states have been locked down either because they've already passed or refused to pass the constitutional amendment in question, but all told, it was a marvelously simple system that felt a little bit like the real game and allowed me to concentrate on my own moves. And so I didn't feel like I was managing an opponent for me, that it was mostly that I was reacting to something that somebody else was doing, which is exactly what I want. And it gave me more ability to appreciate all the historical details that were worked in, because I think one of the great things about historical gaming that's been happening, especially over the past 10 years, but especially over the past 5, I think, is that it's moving away from the overarching and relentless emphasis on war. For a long time, historical gaming was wargaming, and the two were effectively interchangeable. And I really appreciate the fact that Votes for Women takes a lot of the mechanisms and game elements inspired from historical wargaming and preserving the sense of historicity and preserving the sense of place and preserving some of the conventions like designers' notes, like developers' notes, like historical notes, and importing them into other great moments in history, because I was shocked to discover that there are significant events in history that do not involve armed conflict. I know.
Is that possible?
Your silence absolutely represents your level of shock and surprise. And I, too, was similarly flabbergasted. And the suffrage movement in the United States is a great example because, and it's one of the examples that I think this political moment needs, if you'll allow me to wax political for a few moments, because you cannot tell the story of the suffrage movement without being intersectional, because it necessarily entails elements of class, of race, of immigration, of lots of other issues. And so it's woven seamlessly through the narrative of the game, because the narrative of the game is the narrative of the suffrage movement by and large. Although I still keep playing Sojourner Truth, not for the event, but it's for a campaign action that wounds me deep in my heart every time I do it. But anyway, setting all that aside, I love Votes for Women. I wish it had become more broadly available in Canada in 2022. It absolutely would have made my list of the top 10 of 2022. And the components remain a delight. The production is a joy. Fort Circle Games deserves every plaudit it's been getting. Votes for Women is outstanding. And I think that everybody who has not yet played a historically inflected game like this would be an excellent place to start. Not only because of how well the history is rendered, and not only because of the fact that it imports a lot of these historical wargaming conventions into a non-war game, but because of how approachable the rule set is. And it manages to preserve that level of chrome. Card-driven games at their best allow this level of chrome without a high degree of rules up front. And so I absolutely think that this is the best approachable card-driven game. Definitely, I prefer this over Watergate. I think that 1960 Making of a President was, again, married to a bad scoring system. The Electoral College is a bad scoring system. I don't like it in politics. I don't like it in games. But constitutional amendments work far, far better. So, at any rate, I could wax Rexotic for a lot longer about my enthusiasm for Votes for Women. I was a joy to bring it back, even in the solo version. I still look forward to trying the opposition party against an actual human opponent. Votes for Women, designed by Tory Brown, published by Fort Circle Games.
Well, speaking of solos that want to feel like the game, I'll take it a step further so that game feels like yet another game. I played Joan of Arc Orleans Draw and Write solo version. It has that great mechanism where you flip a card, and it has a table on one side, and it uses the back of the next card that's coming up.
Yes.
And I just think that's a cool mechanism. And it makes gameplay very easy for solo version. Mark and I played the regular version, and it's sort of drafting the traditional Orleans workers from pool. And all the solo deck does is it says start at the top or the bottom of this list, and whatever's available, take that first thing. It's nice and easy. And if it's a monk, then you're going to do the back of the card. And if you're playing like of the 3 little mini modules you can do in the solo version, the backs of the cards do all sorts of different things. So it's nice and interesting. I like the full color sheets. The front part is when you're playing multiplayer. The back is for the solo. Played great. What did you think of the normal game of Joan of Arc?
As a roll and write, it was fine. I mean, drafting is fundamentally what roll and writes do much of the time. Here, at least, there was a little bit more interactivity in the sense that it was an exclusive draft. So if you look at the That's So Clever games, typically it's a non-exclusive draft. Everyone can take the same value if they want. And it felt a little less spreadsheety than a lot of the very spreadsheety roll and write games. There was a map where you were kind of notionally traveling around and building things. So it was slightly better than where a lot of the action was, for me anyway, which was just crossing off squares in a goods matrix, which is basically just filling out some sort of weird matrix anyway. So it was okay. I mean, you could do a lot worse as far as roll and writes are concerned. If you're enthusiastic about the main game Orléans, that'll help you in some areas, hinder you in others. During your rules explanation, you very gamely were like, okay, but it's important to understand that in this version, it's different from the actual version of Orléans because you can't do X. I'm like, I don't remember Orléans well enough to remember
what X was.
So I wasn't confused, but thank you. So I don't know that it's necessarily the kind of thing where a lot of your knowledge can be imported because, again, it's mostly about filling out a matrix of stuff. But the components were nice. As you say, the setting is sold kind of sort of through the graphics. The sheet is very nice. You know, like, again, comparing this to a That's So Clever or a lot of other dice-based roll and writes, I did feel like I was doing something a little bit more substantial. And the less said about Welcome To's Hey Geography of the Suburbs, the better. So you could do a lot worse as far as I'm concerned.
So this was a review copy given to us right from the designer, Ryan Hendrickson. And the other designer was Reiner Stockhausen. Our copy was from DLP Games. And I felt it really did reflect the Orleans, because remember all the buildings that you could choose from, right? That is more than what other roll and writes have.
That's true.
So it was like, 20 different buildings you get to choose from, which makes your choices of those, of the chits that you happen to draft, you have choices to do with them. The movement around the map, like you said, felt very similar. And if you built a building, then everyone else has to cross it off on their sheet. There's a lot of that throughout the whole sheet at all, where you're crossing off, it's sort of a race to certain parts of the map.
Kind of. I mean, one of the salient differences is that in Orléans, you do have to kind of commit spatially to where your worker is. Every time you move, you're leaving behind opportunities, as opposed to the roll and write, which partially for physical reasons and partially for other game design reasons, I suspect, you're just expanding your network of availability. And so you're not really making any sacrifices or leaving anything behind every time you travel.
Plays a lot quicker than Orleans does, that's for sure.
Yeah, the level of decision-making was pretty good given the duration of the game. And I will say, as will come up later when we talk about another drafting game, there were some instances where I took workers specifically because I knew you'd be able to make better use of them. So there was a certain amount of player interactivity in that sense.
Well, the fact that I went back to it and played a solo version tells you something. I'm looking forward to playing more often. Even Warm Boy, he is sort of, I guess, the roll and rate connoisseur, is very much looking forward to it. And that is Joan of Arc, Orleans, Draw, and Write.
Look at this connoisseur in Orléans showing off your French.
I know.
Everyone knows that you started this podcast just so you could show off your French, Walker. It's a little tiresome, frankly. You dial it back just a bit, okay?
I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
I apologize.
Okay. I'll be sure to edit this part out. Get to play another game of Quantum. Quantum is the Eric Zimmerman super minimalistic, almost 4X-y, but mostly punch someone in the face dice game. And this is, unfortunately, super out of print. A lot of people are looking for copies, but it doesn't look like it's going to be reprinted anytime soon, which is a shame. It's a very approachable, very quick game. If you want to engage in silly space battles, you could do a lot worse. And you get to have a lot of the touchstones of 4X. You get to move around the galaxy and control parts of the map and get special powers and do weird techs and all those other kinds of things. The key conceit of Quantum is that all your ships are dice, and they move a number of spaces equal to their pip value, but in combat, lower values are better, so the low-value dice are really good at fighting, but really bad at moving around the map, and the higher-value dice. On top of that, every die face has its own special ability, which doesn't cost an action, and so you can really exert some clever combos to try to eke out that win, or to try to prevent somebody from horning in on your territory. And I've enjoyed Quantum every time I've played it. It's not always the most balanced experience in the world. Some people get more turns than others, and that can be determinative. Very often the end game can degenerate into a whack the leader fest, but given the relative absence of rules grit and how approachable and delightful the theme is and how well it's executed, I find it hard to complain. If the game were twice as long as it were, absolutely Quantum's failings would be serious failings. As it is, they're just little quirks. And so I wish it would go back in print. My understanding is that this time they wouldn't have to give out 2 sets of replacement dice for the original oily dice, for those who got the original versions. I have all 3 sets of Quantum dice that Funforge sent to me. Maybe I'm responsible for it not being reprinted.
How much they cost just to send you all those dice to Canada, isn't it? Like
I'm the problem.
$600.
I was in America at the time.
Oh, all right, no problem then.
But I'm the monster. It's me. I'm the problem.
Mark, this realization that you just got.
That's Quantum,
we all
designed
got
by
there.
Eric Zimmerman and Funforge, and you'll never have it again because I'm greedy for dice. I use the dice.
Speaking about being
Is that
greedy
okay?
for dice.
Does that make it better?
Wow, what happened in our gang of dice, Mark? Who's greedy for dice there?
That'd be me.
Yeah, exactly. So, speaking of silly dice games, we played Gang of Dice by Reiner Knizia, published by Mandoo Games, a few times. 2-player, not so much. It's more of just reacting to what the other player rolled. Once you add more than 2 players, though, it becomes much more of a game. So you're flipping up a card that is a threshold that you do not want to get to.
You want to get as high as possible without going over the threshold. Sometimes the threshold's a number. Sometimes the threshold's a specific combination of dice.
And you choose how many you're going to roll. You roll them, Yahtzee style. You roll your initial, and then you get 2 re-rolls. Totally friendly. Pick whatever dice you want to re-roll. And then you're stuck with what you have, and the other players have to decide how many dice they're going to roll, and whoever rolls the most pips wins that round and gets the dice. After 12 rounds, whoever has the most dice wins the game. And if it's tied in pips, it's whoever rolled the most dice.
Yeah, with 2 players, it was very simple to react to whatever the star player did. With multiplayer, suddenly you have this realm of uncertainty about what to do. If the first player gets a low total, well, obviously you want to go beat that. But if they busted, you don't know how conservative you get to be because someone's always waiting down your back. Fortunately, the turn order issues aren't as degenerate as they might seem. More on that later in another Reiner Knizia game. Because whenever you win a round, you're the star player for the next round. Now, granted, if one player is dominating, you definitely want to be sitting to their right as opposed to their left, but that having been said, in a game of this duration, it wasn't so bad. In my defense, at the start of the game, Walker clearly explained that the tokens were equivalent to dice, and what you do when you're low on dice...
When When you're what on dice?
When you're low on dice.
Low on dice.
Yeah.
Gotcha, okay.
When you're low on dice, what you do, because the game comes with a lot of dice in the gang of dice, but to supplement that, there are these tokens. You hand the token to somebody else, and then they give you 3 dice, and it's all equivalent. At the end of the game, you want to have the most dice, but the tokens are worth 3 dice. The problem was I just felt low on dice all the time. And so I was constantly giving people the tokens that I had at the start of the game so I could have more dice. Because it was a great comfort to me, Walker.
Yeah.
I felt that I would eventually have enough dice to fill the hole in my heart.
I feel a dice problem is evolving here, Mark, and maybe a dice intervention might be.
I can stop anytime I want.
Sure you can. Dice.
That was Gang of Dice by Mandoo Games, definitely the most delicious publisher name I know of. Played a game of Libertalia Winds of Galecrest. This is the Stonemaier Games reprint of the Paolo Mori original of about 10 years ago. And I got the interesting perspective of somebody else at the table for whom Libertalia is a big deal. And he spent much of the game reminding me of the differences between the core game, the original game, the one that's foremost in his heart at least, and the one we were playing. Libertalia Winds of Galecrest is, to my mind, superior to the original for the following reason. It is slightly less chaotic. Now, it's a simultaneous action selection game, and so necessarily in Libertalia there's going to be a certain amount of craziness in that you try to anticipate what other people are playing, but you don't really have a good sense of why they'd play one card before another in a given round sometimes. So it's like, oh, they played the card that neutralizes my card this round. Oh well. Ha ha ha. And it's okay, look, that's fine, to a certain extent. In the original version of Libertalia, I definitely got the impression that simply resolving the different card abilities after they were played caused a certain amount of head scratching, and at that point, you're not really able to make any anticipatory plays. Like, well, if I play B, and he plays C, and she doesn't play D, at the same time as somebody else might have played E at a previous round, then victory. Instead, in the Stonemaier Games version, it's a little more straightforward. It's like, well, if nobody else plays this other card this round, I'll get to where I want to go. And quite frankly, when it comes to that level of chaos, I don't also want a head-hurting level of permutations on top of that. Some people disagree. And definitely it was the case that after playing Libertalia Winds of Galecrest, some people were persuaded that this was the better version. Other people were very much persuaded that the original was the better version. That having been said, there are 2 versions you can play in Winds of Galecrest. One of them is slightly more intricate than the other, but at the end of the day, they're very, very similar. And this is very much the sort of thing, let's call this the Antoine Boza model of game design, because this was designed by Paolo Mori, and we at Swag are huge fans of most of Paolo Mori's designs, except for arguably the design that made him famous, which is to say Libertalia. It's not my favorite game generally, and it's certainly not my favorite of Paolo Mori's games. Similarly with Antoine Boza, we're both big fans of the games of Antoine Boza, with the exception of Seven Wonders, which is the game he's best known for. This comes up not infrequently with respect to some of our preferred designers, but anyway. Libertalia Winds of Galecrest by Paolo Mori, put up by Stonemaier Games last year.
We both got to play a game called Hamlet, the village building game. This was also a review copy given to us by the distributor. It's designed by David Chircop and published by Mighty Board Games. And it's very interesting, sort of the tiles that you're using to build this village are very uniquely shaped. And the resource system is very interesting as well, because none of the resources actually belong to anyone really. And the majority of the game, you're just figuring out how to move them to where you need them. And so you're building victory point tiles, you're building parts of the church, you're just trying to get the most victory points. Very interesting game. We streamed it this week, so if you want to check it out, you can check our live channel on YouTube. Mark, what did you think of Hamlet, the village building game?
Okay, I'm not in a position to give my full impressions because we played with a minor rules error. And what Hamlet seeks to do is exploit a couple of different things. First of all, you want to be able to exploit the changing economy of advanced goods. They're the basic goods that start out on the board, and then there are the advanced goods that get introduced as various people build new buildings. And trying to work out the web of intersecting incentives whereby it is in your interest to develop a good that somebody else will use to build something is potentially interesting. Very Splotter-esque in that sense, right? Similarly, Splotter-esque is kind of layered on top of that is mostly it's about getting resources where they want to be. You've got a very strong spatial element. And it's not even so much about what you're able to do, it's about where you're able to get the resources. And through this, you need to hire lots of donkeys. And in point of fact, it's one of those cases where your donkeys might even be more important than your workers. Because if your goods network is sufficiently robust, having fewer actions isn't necessarily a downside because your actions will be more efficient. That part I found reasonably satisfying, and that part at least was played properly by the rule set we did. I was getting strong Keyflower vibes, both by virtue of the sort of evolving nature of the economy, and by virtue of the emphasis on getting goods to where they needed to go. A difference, though, is that the way that tiles enter the system in Keyflower is based on an utterly brilliant auction mechanism, as opposed to the way tiles enter the system in Hamlet, which I found comparatively less engaging.
But I like how they not so much as you purchase them to get them into the game. I like how it sort of video game them into the mix. It's like you have, the quarry, and evolves into, where you get better rocks, or the granary evolves into the bread making, and then you add all these extra tiles. It's sort of like leveling up like you do in a video game. And I like how the feel of that.
Sure. I mean, it's a fine way to influence the influx of new tiles, but there's a complete disconnect between who triggers this so-called evolution and who gets to benefit from that so-called evolution. If I'm the one who builds the building that gives us access to basic grain, when and how the advanced grain tile comes out of the bag and who's able to take advantage of that is entirely disconnected from that. And indeed, I might be more interested in exploiting that tile when it comes out due to, again, the way the incentive structure of the resources works. If I'm the one in Hamlet who first exposes the economy to advanced grain, my grain will always be the superior grain, the top shelf, the premium, the par excellence grain. But at the end of the day, it doesn't serve to give, players a very specific sense of agency. At the end of the day, it's mostly tactical, just responding to what short-term building incentives exist. And again, that was also something that I felt might have been lacking, a little bit more long-term incentives or a greater control over how the economy shifts. I might have appreciated a little more, because frequently, as I say, this might have been a prospect of the rules error. I will absolutely be returning back to Hamlet in short order so I can get a better sense of this. But very often I got the sense that I needed to be very careful just not to set up the next person to do too well. And that disincentivized me from doing things that I might have otherwise have been inclined to do. And sometimes that made the economy less interesting than it could have been. So I'm cautiously optimistic about some aspects of Hamlet. And indeed, when I compare it unfavorably to Keyflower, that isn't necessarily a grave insult, because Keyflower is amazing. But I would like to see how it works when played with all the rules perfectly applied.
And that is Hamlet, the village building game.
Not enough Danes as well. People were too happy and there weren't enough Danes.
More Danes. More maybe like barbarian raids from the sides, I think, were in short order. From Mighty Boards.
Played a game of Claustrophobia 1643. This is the second edition of the two-player kind of sort of fantasy Space Hulk-ish game designed by Croc. The redesign was also co-designed by Laurent Pouchain, who has been involved in a number of skirmishy adjacent type things that I've really appreciated coming out of France. And this was a game I got to introduce to Chip III, who comes from a sort of tabletop miniatures wargaming background. And as always, a great time was had by all. Very much like Space Hulk, you can play the first scenario over and over and over again. I've played Survivors at this point probably 36 times all told across the two editions, and I'm still not tired of it. Playing both sides is wonderful. I experienced the same old gripes and appreciation of the new edition of Claustrophobia. Graphically, I think it's a step back. They've tried to replace some language elements with icons that I can never really remember again, despite my experience with the game. And the miniatures are no longer pre-painted, but by the same token, this is a curated edition with a lot of expansion elements that are already baked in, and an interesting card system for the human player to give them a little bit more variety, especially as the game draws on. So I wish there was some sort of way I could have everything in one edition, but as it is, suffice to say, you can find the base game of the original Claustrophobia for sale in the secondhand market, my understanding is, without too much difficulty. And I can tell you, my preferred edition is 1643, but just barely. So you definitely get the more adorable troglodytes. And really, at the end of the day, when you're evaluating board games to purchase, cuteness of troglodyte, I think, is an underappreciated criterion.
Top 10.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is one of the absolute best two-player skirmish-adjacent kind of fantasy games. It's right up there with Space Hulk, as far as I'm concerned. Claustrophobia is a marvelous game. Shame about the Kickstarter-only distribution by Monolith. I think they could have, with a very small amount of effort, made it a more modest, medium-box affair that would have been price-accessible to a lot of people. But instead, they went Kickstarter-only because that's how Monolith be. That's just how Monolith be. So that's Claustrophobia 1643.
So I got to play Spots. It was on Board Game Arena, but we do have a review copy from the publisher. Spots was designed by Alex Hague and John Perry and Justin Vickers, and it is a great little push-your-luck game. Looks very adorable.
So cute.
You have these Dalmatian dogs, and for the spots, they sort of outline their spots to make dice.
Well, they're not all dogs, Walker. Did you see the non-dog?
I did. The one.
His name is Doog.
He fools them all. So there's all these different actions that you can get to roll dice in different ways. And dice you can't use, you have to bury. But if your bury pool ever gets above 7, then you completely bust. And how badly you bust is all determined on how much you pushed your luck, because you might have taken a turn to cash in the cards that were full. You might have thought you could fill the cards. And if you bust, then you remove all of the dice that you haven't cashed in and start again. It is easy to teach, quick to play. I would definitely try it out. Spots.
Yeah, Spots is adorable. I should really get it back to the table again soon. We played Piazza Rabazza by Guido Hoffman and Jens Peter Schliemann by Zoch Verlag. So.
This is why we're friends, by the way.
Is that all the reason why?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, this is one of the reasons why.
Well, honestly, okay, you joke, but to my mind, I try not to judge someone too harshly, but I immediately appreciate someone more if they like hobbyist games and also dexterity games. Because there's a certain class of hobbyist gamer that has no time for dexterity games. Now, some people it's because of accessibility issues. Zero judgment there, obviously. But then there's some people that's like, oh, you go play with your toys. I'm like, yeah, I will absolutely go play with my toys. No doubt about it. I like toys when it's Heroescape. I like toys when it's Claustrophobia. I like toys when it's Food Chain Magnet. I like toys when it's Piazza Rabazza. So the way Piazza Rabazza works, magnets and wind-up toys. Do I have you? Have I lost you? I lost you, didn't I?
I hope not.
The people who are left, you're my kind of people. The way that it works is you're delivering pizzas, and sadly, I will admit, there's some tired racial stereotypes involved. Your delivery driver is Luigi, whatever. They're not that the name Luigi is a tired stereotype, but it's very. They're leading into a certain vision of Italy and Italian people. At any rate, you have this plastic scooter at the end of basically a flat stick, and you have to maneuver your pizza delivery person with these metal pizzas, but all the walls are magnetic, and so you have to deliver them to the correct wall, which represents the correct patron. Easy enough? Nope.
Just so you get the vision, because the whole town is sort of raised half an inch off the table, so you can slide this motorcycle through these doorways and pass.
Well, the motorcycle is impeded by the walls, but the stick on which the motorcycle is mounted is not, and so you're sliding around. All the while, the entire structure is wobbling like crazy because there's this spin-up toy in the middle that causes it to vibrate erratically. It's marvelous. It was such a great game.
And the story about it is great because, it's every morning he gets up to knead the dough with
such vigor.
And he pounds it under the table so hard that the whole villa shakes.
Yeah. And I would say it was probably a touch too long. But other than that, it was marvelous. I mean, very often I comment that when it comes to dexterity games, the victory conditions sometimes fall apart. So you've got a toy, but, at the end of the day, you can't take it as seriously as a game. Not that I'm super competitive, but, I'd prefer that I feel like it's a relatively fair competitive environment. Piazza Rabazza has a very interesting system whereby if you accidentally deliver a pizza to the wrong person and it's something that somebody else was looking for, they get to score it. And so what that does is it means that you have to be very careful at where you go and how so as to avoid accidentally handing points to your opponent.
Yeah, it's not as though you misjudge or missee anything or accidentally do it. It's because it's magnetic. As you drive by, they just sort of, it sucks it to the wall.
Yeah.
The story is they reach out and grab it because everyone ordered pizza. They just assumed it's theirs.
Precisely. And so you took the risk. You plotted that route. And so if you're careless or it's so good. I don't know how I would feel about it multiplayer though, because the downtime might become insufferable. Because one of the virtues is you don't keep going until your pizza gets snagged. You keep going until the wind-up toy runs out of energy. And so the runs are just long enough to let you go for a difficult route a couple times or snag an easy route and then go for other routes. And that part is really interesting and great. You have to manage your time. But if you're sitting there waiting for 3 other people to finish their routes, I could see that getting a little bit tedious. But I'm curious to find out.
Well, I don't think I'd want to play with 4, but 3 would maybe not be so bad.
Well, start with 3, see if that's doable. Yeah, absolutely. This is why I got into hobby gaming. This is one of the things that keeps me so deeply in the clutches of hobby gaming. Piazza Rabazza is a delight.
We also got to play Findorf. This is the new Friedman Freeze game. So this one is the Rio Grande Games Edition because they put it out in North America. And he never fails to please. This is yet another fantastic game where you have a list of actions you can do as sort of it is definitely a rondelle.
It's basically a rondelle, yeah.
So you're going through the rondelle and you can upgrade these actions, I guess, Crusader style in a way, because everything and the flow of this game.
It's real.
The flow is real, Mark. At the very beginning, everything is just one sale, one buy, hire one worker, and then one of the actions is to improve your board, and that just means more actions when you activate that. Because
if you've got the money,
it's action efficiency. You want to, get the most of your actions. You want to be able to sell stuff when you want, because it is a normal market where when you sell stuff, the price will go down, and you want to be able to do things when it's available and when the prices are high.
Findorf also is under the general mold of Paolo Mori and Antoine Bozat in that he is best known for a game that we're not huge fans of, namely Power Grid. And despite the fact that he's been on an absolute tear over the past 5 years of designing stellar release after stellar release, Friedman Freeze doesn't design a whole lot of economic games. And he uses more or less the same market mechanism here that he did in Power Grid. There are certain forces and economic elements that just naturally consume peat. Peat is the only item or good that's on the open market. You can buy and sell other things, but they work on a slightly different economy. And I wish that part, specifically the market fluctuation of peat prices, meant more. It was significant-ish in the very early part of the game, and then it quickly faded into irrelevance. 4 would get taken off for houses, but then the actions would just add 4 more back onto the market. Okay, we're at the same price. And then by that point, the peat being worth $1 more or $1 less didn't really matter. No one's economy really relied on selling vast quantities of peat, because by the end game, you're producing lots more valuable elements anyway. Maybe this would shake out differently in other games. I'm eager to find out. But overall, the economic element, that part of it, didn't seem to manifest to a terribly satisfying way.
Yeah, because it take up the whole bottom of the board, and we only played, it only fluctuated the very bottom end.
Yes, it all stayed within the same narrow band. And quite frankly, it contributed to Findorf on occasion, despite being very, very rules light and very rules effective in terms of how efficient all the mechanisms are. It led Findorf to feel a little bit fiddly in that we were constantly moving pieces around the railroads on top of that, and yeah. And the overall tempo of the rondelle, though, I found fascinating, because as you get to the bottom of the rondelle, you automatically pass, you do what... This is how you know it's a Eurogame. It has a bureaucracy phase. Are you having fun yet? And the answer is yes, because you kind of sort of pay a penalty, but by the same token, you might get some income, you liberate your workers and do that. And how often you want to do that is really a function of what stage of the gameplay you're in, what the stage of your infrastructure is, where you're getting your cash, etc., etc. And so those trade-offs are great, because unlike a lot of other rondelle games, and I think this may be the only time I've ever seen it in something that's so obviously a rondelle, you don't have to advance your worker. You can do the same action multiple times in a row. And indeed, that's what I did right at the start of the game. I took a look at the board, I'm like, okay, and I just pinged the first action 2 or 3 times in succession. And I just liked that freedom. That option made it feel very, very different while still having a lot of the benefits and trade-offs and tempo considerations of your traditional rondelle game. I'm a big fan of Friedman Freeze's games, and I think that Findorf is another excellent big box Euro release from him.
And it definitely gives you that sort of race feeling, because you're building these big everyone's 50 points, these buildings, and they're slowly disappearing, and you're debating whether you want to do this action a couple more times, or do you want to race around. All the tension was there. Very much looking forward to trying it again. And
just to emphasize the score system, this is indeed one of the things that I find so refreshing in your comparatively simpler Euro designers like Friedman Freeze, like Reiner Knizia. the scoring system for Findorf effectively bakes in the miscellaneous scoring for cashing in your old resources. And it's just like, oh, okay, well, to keep things simple, there's not going to be a separate score phase. It's just here's what everything's worth at the end of the game. Buildings are worth 50, and all your money is traded in on a one-to-one basis. It's like, okay. It was just a great way to emphasize what's important and what's not, while at the same time not having some sort of more convoluted scoring scheme that would have effectively gotten you to the same place. That was Findorf by Friedman Freeze. I played a game called Nemesis Lockdown, Walker.
Do tell.
Longtime listeners of the show know that although we've enjoyed lots of games by Adam Kwapinski and Awakened Realms in the past, we're big fans of Lords of Hellas and some other things by Awakened Realms have done, Nemesis was not really for us. We strongly disliked Nemesis. Nemesis Lockdown, however, had two things that made me try it. One was the assertion that, oh, well, it's different now, to a certain extent. And number two, I knew that I had a crowd that would enjoy it. And so I figured, why not? Let's try Nemesis Lockdown. Some of the changes I overall enjoyed. There's this notion of the power that's going on in the facility. Rather than being a ship, it's in a facility. There are these power tokens, and you can only use certain systems if they're powered. There are certain things that make the monsters more deadly in the dark, and there are ways to manipulate what sections are powered and for how long, and so on and so forth. That part I thought was kind of clever.
Let me guess, though. The facility was built randomly, and there's no wall map or blueprint or anything.
Correct.
Gotcha.
And now they don't even... So for a while, I was like, oh, okay, well, here's the perfect explanation. Are we all from outside the facility? Then we wouldn't know where things would be. No, some people work in the facility. So I don't understand why they don't know where... Anyway, at least in Nemesis, they had the thematic explanation, something cryosleep. Memory problems. Whatever. Okay, setting that aside. There was another new system in Nemesis that felt somewhat egregiously random. There's this notion of a protocol about what the evil corporation / government in power will do once the game is over. They might murder everyone who hasn't sent the signal. They might murder everyone who hasn't studied the aliens enough. They might just murder everyone in the isolation room but leave everyone else alone, etc., etc. And this is based on a semi-random system where you can kind of make some deductions over the course of the game, but at the end of the day, it's mostly a stab in the dark. So, if you fulfill your victory conditions, which are usually based on random factors anyway, and you manage to survive, which are usually based on random factors anyway, then you have to hope that by the end of the game, the random tile pull doesn't mean, oh, guess what? You're dead. So there's that. I was reminded of all the things I didn't like about Nemesis. The overwhelming majority of the time, when you care at all about either the victory conditions or the whatever story is going on in your head, it's about getting from point A to point B and trying to find the right room, which is based on a random tile layout, and just moving around is so tedious and takes so long and full of so much upkeep. And then an alien shows up and everything grinds to a halt. Even people that were feeling the Nemesis vibe, because I remember the process of playing Nemesis for the first time. I was so excited. I was enthusiastic. I was like, oh, okay, well, there are some neat things. And then the alien shows up and it's just the ultimate expression of tedium and lockdown. And not in the sense of the title, but that's what they mean by the title, I think. I got to do the thing that every game explainer hates the most. I get to remind people, no, you're in combat. You can't do that. No, I'm sorry, you're in combat. You can't. No, you can't. You can't. So I get to tell somebody, wait, so I've already shot all my ammo at the alien and it's not dead, right? So all I can do is run away, in which case it hits me and I die. Or I can melee it and half the time I'll die anyway. Yes, that is exactly the situation you're in. Okay. Yeah. There are ways to communicate the deadliness of aliens without bogging everything down. But anyway, this would just be a retread of the original Nemesis game. I don't see any reason why Lockdown will win you over if the original Nemesis didn't do it for you. There was slightly more personality in the character decks. I'll give it that. That and the power system was kind of okay, but utterly the same fundamental systems that I loathed and found tedious in the basic Nemesis, coupled with a very strange protocol system. There's going to be another Nemesis system. A third game. Apparently it's going to emphasize more player versus player combat. No thank you.
I just threw up in my mouth a little.
Yeah, that's Nemesis Lockdown. If Nemesis is for you, if you like Nemesis, if you're like the rest of the world that goes on and on about how it's a gripping narrative, that time I stumbled blindly from point A to point B, this'll be more. By Adam Kwapinski, published by Awakened Realms.
Mark, we got Blue Lagoon back to the table finally. This is designed by Reiner Knizia and put out by Blue Orange Games. This is like the sort of talked about 2-phase game where the first phase, you're sort of seeding the board with your huts. So you have better table presence in phase 2, where you're spreading out even more and blocking people off, where it's more of a sort of go type, blocking game for the second part.
Ooh, a very highfalutin comparison
I
there.
know. Whew.
Yeah. Yeah, Blue Lagoon is frequently compared to Through the Desert in a number of ways, especially that Through the Desert itself is arguably a 2-phase game, because first you're placing your leaders, and that's very consequential.
Is that because they both come in very small boxes, Mark?
I'm not going to dignify that block.
Okay.
But in Blue Lagoon, at least, it has the benefit of the first phase being a little bit more protracted, and so you don't have all the major decisions front-loaded. But yeah, lots of blocking, lots of snagging resources, lots of triage, lots of trying to threaten someone else's board position to force them into playing in a way that's suboptimal for them and costing them tempo. Marvelously approachable game, incredibly simple rule set. The most complicated thing is the scoring, which is not uncommon in Reiner Knizia games. But I really like Blue Lagoon. It's hard to get to the table because people forget which one Blue Lagoon is. I mean, people make... Step 1, they make a joke about the movie. Step 2, they ask which one Blue Lagoon is again. And I say, it's the Reiner Knizia tile-laying game. And then their eyes kind of glaze over. It's like, wait, which...
2-phase game. Oh, yeah, that one.
I still haven't had much luck with that. Blue Lagoon, marvelous game. Lovely lightweight tile layer by Reiner Knizia.
Did you know Nissan EVs have traveled 8 billion miles? Just a quick trip to Pluto and back. And what did we learn along the way? Well, that an EV can take on the world, like the Nissan Leaf. It can move racing forward and take your breath away, like the all-new Nissan Ariya. We learned to make EVs that electrify. 8 billion miles driven by Leaf owners globally since 2010. 2023 Ariya has limited availability. All-wheel drive expected availability early 2023, subject to change.
With one of the best savings rates in America, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than choosing Slash to be in your band.
Next up for lead guitar. You're in.
Cool. Yep, even easier than that. And with no fees or minimums on checking and savings accounts, is it even a decision? That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet?
Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One N.A. member FDIC.
And those are the games we played this week. Now on to the news and why it doesn't matter. Just a reminder, for those of you that are encountering ads on So Very Wrong About Games for the first time, ad-free versions of the podcast are available on Patreon, so go check us out. And also, if you ever encounter an ad that you think is an unfortunate association that we shouldn't have, please do let us know. We're not in a position to comment because we're in Ontario and we haven't been able to hear any ads yet, and this is because we've told them no ads for gambling. And if you ever listened to podcasts in Ontario over the course of the past few months, you've probably heard a lot of ads for gambling.
I just want to say, if you consume any content whatsoever, make sure you reach out to those content creators and let them know how you feel. And if it is another board game creator, make sure you tell the publisher how they influence some of your purchases and whatever games that you want them to cover.
Finally, it's a news light week, but this is a very important news. There's a call for submissions by Board Game Academics. BoardGameAcademics.com/submissions. I'm going to include this link in the episode notes. They're calling for papers in pretty much any academic field. They want an abstract and a representation of your academic CV. They're accepting applications and submissions until the end of this month. They plan on having a sort of pseudo conference at Gen Con this year. And although I'm no longer in that particular game, I absolutely love the fact that people are approaching board games and board game design from a more academic perspective and from a theoretical lens. So if you're at all interested, if you're still in any academic field, or if you're doing any sort of academic research on board games or board gaming, please do take a look at BoardGameAcademics.com/submissions.
That is the news and why it doesn't matter. Now on to our main review, Reiner Knizia's Mille Fiori.
So our feature game this week is Mille Fiori. Mille Fiori is Italian for Million Fiore, I think. Designed by Reiner Knizia and published by Schmidt-Spiel of 2021.
A million flowers.
No, it's actually 1,000 flowers, Walker. You stepped on the joke.
A million.
So the joke is, it's not...
A million.
Now that I explained the joke, it's necessarily more funny. This is what I'm told by some of the less funny people of my acquaintance. Mille Fiori is a 2 to 4 player drafting, tiling game that is not entirely unlike a roll and write. More on that later. Reiner Knizia is a venerable game designer, and I've given him an intro more times than once in this podcast. Suffice to say that any 2 or 3 of his games might qualify him into the ranks of some of the greatest designers ever made. Even people who don't like him say Reiner Knizia's games, they're overrated. He's designed lots of terrible games. That is true. I will freely concede Reiner Knizia has designed lots of terrible games. He's also the guy who did Through the Desert, Tigris and Euphrates, Blue Moon, Raw, etc., etc. So there's that. Anyway, Walker, why didn't you give us an unhelpful summary about what one does in A Million Fioris?
Well, I feel as though Dr. Knizia was just getting tired of the whining. There's no player interaction in my roll and write. No problem, he says. Hold my bow time. Bam! Suck it. Mille Fiori, here you go. We got hate drafting. We have sniping. We have blocking. We have bluffing. We have area enclosure. We have first to a threshold. Point scoring. Limited resources. Turn manipulation. Multi-use cards. That's nothing to do with player interaction. I was just like on a roll there.
You just wanted to include it?
Yeah.
I think you just destroyed your rhythm, though. You going to get the rhythm back?
No. It's gone now.
How do you hold someone's bow tie? Is it untied? Like, does he untie it?
I think it's like a clip-on. He like flicks at you.
I don't think he wears.
He says, "Hold my bow tie."
If you're devoted to that lifestyle, I don't think you wear a clip-on.
True.
I would hope not. Jeez, that would be embarrassing. If your image is based on a clip-on, jeez.
That's the dial-in.
Yes.
So I feel as though Mille Fiori is very much an interaction roll and write. End of story.
Yeah, so the reason why we compare it to a roll and write is here are some of the hallmarks of it. You have a variety of different places on the board, all of which score somewhat differently. And in explaining just the various scoring conditions, one gets a very strong roll and write vibe because that is one of the hallmarks of the design space. Like, well, this scores triangularly based on this sets, while this wants you to have a whole bunch in a row. This has pyramids. This has... Anyway.
And if you get this, then it combos off of that. And lets you do another card over here.
Yes.
And this lets you do this over here. And
Once you meet this threshold, you get to do a whole bunch of other things, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a very strong roll and write vibe from there. But as we frequently comment, one of the things that you have in a roll and write is everyone's got their own sheet, and everyone fills out their own little grid, whether it's a matrix, whether it's a map, what have you. Even when it's a map, even when it's a first 2, it's typically a question of, it's like, well, I got to the 5, and everyone's like, okay, well, I'll cross out the 5, but I have lots of other places that I can get to. Here, it's all on a shared board. You're putting out and I'm not kidding, your lozenges, which are these very pretty, semi-transparent pieces of plastic, which are meant to represent glass, because Mille Fiori is Italian for 1 million pieces of glass.
Apparently.
Yes.
And the setup is dead easy. Like you said, you put it at the board, and then you shuffle some cards, which seem to be difficult to do properly.
Yes.
And then...
They're small cards. It's hard to shuffle a deck of small cards that's that thick. I don't have anything against small cards. Some people hate small cards. I don't have anything against them except when they're a big deck and it's hard to shuffle them. And then people complain that you didn't shuffle them enough because they don't understand how randomness works. Mille Fiori is Italian for 1 million cards.
And you deal 5 to each player?
Yes.
And you're ready to go. But on that note, man, does it ever look cheap?
Yeah.
Right? They're saying, oh, we're gonna make all these plastic pieces. Well, let's make all of the player pieces out of the same hard, cheap plastic. So even your boat is.
Oh, but I love those.
No,
you don't like the boats?
No, the boats are the clear plastic, so they just look like toys. Your player markers.
They look like they're made out of colored glass.
Would you get on a boat made out of colored glass?
I don't think they're meant to be seaworthy, Walker.
Well,
they're game pieces.
No, Mark. No, they're shipping these goods, Mark.
They're not in the game pieces, Walker.
I would not.
They ship them in other boats.
I would not pay for shipping on a glass boat.
How is this my life? Why am I having this conversation? Am I having a stroke? Is this a fugue?
But it's good that they're boats, though, right? Because it looks like they're riding on waves with how warped the board is.
Yeah, there's that. When you were talking about how cheap the game seems, I was thinking mostly about how incredibly warped the board is. It's a very thin board. People complained about this thinness of board when Stroganoff was published in the retail edition. I now regret saying that I didn't understand what they were getting at, because the moment it warps a little bit, it's almost impossible to get it flat. It's a relatively minor deal, but when you have these relatively large plastic lozenges that are trying to straddle a board that's warping under half of it, I really like the lozenges. You can see what they're covering.
I agree.
But they're nice and colorful. You don't see them in any other kind of game. And the score markers in the boat, they just look unique. I haven't seen them in other board games before.
I suppose.
And I don't expect the boats to be seaworthy, because I'm not an insane person.
They're a little small, Mark. So I don't really...
Yes, Walker, exactly.
So I don't really think that I meant as actually seaworthy. I meant in the game, they are meant to be shipping boats.
Whatever. Sure, fine. Okay, fine. So, we talked about the multi-use cards. Broadly speaking, the way the deck is arranged is that there's almost a one-to-one correspondence between the number of spaces on the board and the number of cards representing those spaces. Almost. So there's a little bit of give.
The book states there is a 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, but it doesn't quite shake out that way for a number of reasons. One of the problems is, for example, in the pyramidal structures, you might end up in a situation where a large number of cards become unplayable even by the end of the game, precisely because that area wasn't focused on enough. Consequently, every card can be used for what is boat movement, which is basically a semi-arbitrary number of points by moving your boat along a trail. You might land on 1 point, you might land on 10 points. It kind of depends. Now, you can plan for this, obviously, but that's the safety valve for cards that are unplayable, because on rare occasions, you do end up in situations where your hand is unplayable.
Of which there are 6 zones to play from. And like you said, you really need to focus on some of these parts. And you said there's some that score all differently, but they all have sort of, if you get all of a certain symbol, you get 20 points.
No, one of each symbol.
One of each, sorry.
Which is either 3 or 4 different kinds of things. And so you're very much incentivized to move on to a new grouping, move on to a next section. Specialization in a given corner of the board is strongly discouraged, with one exception, and that is the sort of top board, which scores you 1 point for every piece in a contiguous group. So ideally you score 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, et cetera, et cetera. And there's just no ceiling to the number of points you can score. You can always get more, which is why I think over some of the games you do see some people going in hardcore. Sometimes, though, you just want to go in, get 4 or 5 pieces there, so you get your 4 different symbols, score your bonus points, which is 20, 15, 10, or 5, depending on how soon you get to it, and then you just move on. Sometimes, though, what that means is you start making the initial investments in an area. You get your 1 or maybe 2 different symbols, but you can't get that 3rd or 4th due to a variety of circumstances, either drafting or positioning. So in other words, there are trade-offs and risks to be made. And that idea of how much should you specialize in a given area is one of the things that I find pulling me in different directions in Mille Fiori, which I would remind you is Italian for a million priorities.
It's so true. Now, speaking of the card drafting, this is very much where you do hate drafting. Yes. Because no matter what cards you get, you'll find something that is somewhat useful. But sometimes you want to go to a specific area, or you know that the next player in line wants to go to a specific area, and you can just use that card to go, for boat movement or take what they were going to do. But you only have a hand of 5 cards, and the last card gets put into a pool for the bonus actions. So in a 4-player game, you're never going to see those cards come back to you. So you can't really sort of depend on any other cards. It's very random what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth.
I really like it in a drafting game where I can look at a hand of cards and say, I bet this is going to come back to me, so I can pass on it the first time. It just doesn't work that way on Mille Fiori. That's okay. But the amount of hate drafting is non-trivial. Often you're just focusing on whatever's going to score you the most points. But again, given the fact that sometimes you have to make those long-term versus short-term trade-offs, you can look at it and say, well, this will give me more points now, but this one is really what the person downstream from me wants. And I can use it to start bootstrapping into that area for future benefit. And so, again, it's one of those pulling in different priorities that Mille Fiori excels in.
So like I just said, you get 5 cards, you're going to play 4 of them. And if you're the first player, it is a very powerful place to be because you get to, that no one's going to take the spot that you want to go to.
Yeah, because you all commit what card you're going to play at the same time, and then they're executed in turn order.
So you know exactly what you're going to get, and it's not going to get sniped out from you. You can go on the key track. You know you're going to get the big points. You're not going to get stuck with the one. Same thing with the ship and other places. You know you're going to get the card you want, and sometimes that can lead to a little bit of problem.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. In theory, it balances out because everyone's going to be first player roughly the same amount of times. But in practice, it can be unsatisfying because when those big plays show up, is unevenly distributed throughout the game. And so it's not uncommon to see a game of Mille Fiori where the start player advantage was really leveraged by the start player, and then next round, the cards that come up just don't do anything for that start player, and so they miss their chance, quote unquote, purely by virtue of how it shook out. And given how incredibly consequential it is, like, not infrequently, it's been a 10, 20-point swing by virtue of who could get there first. And so the risk is huge. And it's literally just a risk about the draw, because you can sit there being the second or third player and say, well, the start player will definitely play this card if they have one, but you have no basis to know if they do. Sometimes later on in the round, you might because of what you passed on, but often it's just, what are they getting from the deck? And those parts felt pretty unsatisfying.
Sometimes it can be unsatisfying because if you're a newer player to it, you might not understand how the scoring works. Because like you said, there are huge turns where you're going to score 40 to 50 points sometimes.
Yeah.
And up to that point, everyone's just getting 1, 2, 5. And then suddenly one player gets, 60 to 40 points. And you're thinking, well, the game's over.
Not 60. 60 is a little high.
It is.
You keep inflating it.
Sorry. 40 to 20 points.
Mille Fiori, after all, is Italian for a million fluctuations.
It's so true. So anyway, newer players might get frustrated or put off or think they've lost the game before it's even started.
Yes, I remember our first game in particular. After I scored, I think I had like 40 points to somebody else's 10, and other people at the table was like, well, the game's over. It's like, nah. I was like, well, look, the game, game's early. There are lots of different areas to go. Sure enough, by the end of the game, that lead had evaporated. I'd been in second, I'd been in third, I'd gone back to first. So yeah, the swings and points can be real, especially by virtue of the fact that there are all these bonus cards to be played. And sometimes those bonus cards hit the table and they just sit there, and then suddenly a couple rounds later, they're the most valuable cards to be played. And they're there for whoever can grab it. Every different region, much like it has its own criterion for giving you those 20, 15, 10, or 5 bonus points. In Mille Fiori, they all have their own condition for when you get to play a bonus card. And sometimes it's literally the case that you snag a bonus action, you play a card from the bonus pool that gives you another bonus action, and you just keep going. And not a whole lot of downtime, but it's definitely those combos that, again, you sometimes see in roll and writes and can be very satisfying to pull off and very frustrating when you miss them, because you do have to be aware of the board position to be able to take advantage of them.
Yeah, and sometimes they can be sniped from you. You could be setting up to get a bonus action.
Right.
And some people might not have the cards they need to do what they want, but they have a card that will take a bonus action, and over in the bonus pool, there is a card that they can actually use. So they just steal your bonus action.
Again, nice to be the start player.
Yep. Grab that card and start a cycle of points that is sometimes interesting.
Yes. Look, the variety of different scoring conditions are nice. The playtime is very manageable. The rules load is very approachable. And you do get a lot of those satisfying elements for drafting. Overall, it's a very pleasant experience, Mille Fiori is. I can't put it in the same ranks as even the upper tier Reiner Knizia designs, because again, I can't help but feeling that how well I'm doing is largely a function of what I've got when I'm in what position in the turn order, which is okay. It's an all right, lightish drafting game. I'd rather play Mille Fiori than a lot of roll and writes for sure, but it's in a different kind of class. It's a little bit heavier. I don't know that it would really appeal to big fans of roll and writes particularly. This is again like a Reiner Knizia take on roll and writes for people like us who want a little more player interaction in their roll and writes. So at the end of the day, it's an easy recommend if you're a massive Reiner Knizia fan, or if that's exactly what you're looking for. But to me, I don't think it has the staying power or quality or depth of decision-making that a lot of other games, even by the same designer, have. So it's an interesting diversion, but I don't think it's anywhere near the best of his work, even in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I will not be looking to play it again.
I
enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed my
wrong.
time with it, but I agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't need to. I won't be requesting it ever again, I don't think. And I'd be willing to play it if people were playing it. But all told, I think I've seen the combinations. It was interesting to learn the ropes. And I'm not saying that we've mastered it, but I don't think that there's enough there to keep going back to Mille Fiori.
And it was suggested by a listener, and we're more than happy to give it a try. And
we are slaves to our overlords, Walker.
That's right.
Well, that's going to do it for this week. Thank you very, very much for joining us for So Very Wrong About Games. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please check out our website, sowronggames.com/contact. You can also go to sowronggames.com to search all of our episodes. If you want to know if we've discussed a certain game in the past, just put the game name in the search bar and you'll find out in which episodes we discussed the game. And you can also find out how to send us emails or contact us through other social media. We read everything you send us and we'll get back to you if we can. Thank you again very much for spending time with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Peace!
You've been listening to So Very Wrong About Games, produced by Michael Walker and edited by Mark Bigney. Special thanks goes to What Does It Eat for generously allowing us to use their most excellent song, FOS, as our theme. You can find them at whatdoesiteat.com. You can reach us by email at soverywrongaboutgames@gmail.com or on Twitter at SoWrongGames. Thanks very much, see you next time, and always, try to be right, but remember you are so very wrong.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome once again to CMYK Presents Masterpiece Theater in honor of His Grace, the Reverend Dr. Vincent Duke of Diesel, Esquire, OBE. Today we will be discussing the M. Night Shyamalan movie, Knock at the Cabin.
I thought he wasn't allowed to make movies anymore after Avatar.
That's one of the things that's amazing. No matter how many duds he makes, there's always someone willing to give him $20 million. I don't know what it is. There's just always someone willing to fund his next movie. Why can't John Waters get this luck? Not that John Waters is my favorite filmmaker, but John Waters can't raise money for his movies no more. And anyway, I don't understand Hollywood funding.
And in my opinion, I don't think there's any way we can talk about this without spoilers. So be aware, there are spoilers for this movie. I really think so.
You think so?
I think that for me, the premise of this movie, because of the director and because of his pedigree, that there's always this weird twist in the movie.
Yeah.
And it was not in this movie.
That's true.
It was right from the beginning. They told you what it was going to be about.
Yes.
And you keep sort of thinking that it's going to go off in this weird tangent.
Sure.
And it just doesn't.
Yeah.
This is why we're here. This is what has to happen.
Yeah, the premise is laid out in the first 10 minutes of the movie, and that is indeed what happens.
And this is what has to happen. Yeah.
So,
I'm saying that's just what, for me, that's what led to the most tension. Because of his past and what he usually does, I'm just waiting for this interesting.
That's fair.
And not that it was a bad thing. That's what made it so good.
Sure,
was the fact that nothing happened. That this is what.
So sort of a meta. The tension was from a meta perspective because of the viewer's experience with the writer director's previous work.
Just so
interesting. Mostly this movie failed for me because I didn't feel any tension. I kept comparing it in my head, and this may be an unfair comparison. I was comparing it to Cloverfield Lane, in that they've got some similarities as well, right? You've got a bottle situation where people are stuck in a given location, and you have the main character attempting to convince the quote-unquote point of view characters, the normal people, of something manifestly crazy. And the tension being derived from the uncertainty about what they're doing and how violent they're apt to be and what they might do next. The difference is, and I realize that I'm in a minority on this, I think that the script was writing checks that Dave Bautista couldn't cash.
Oh, I think it was the totally opposite.
I don't think. Maybe it was the script's fault either. Right? Sorry, maybe instead it was the script's fault. But I just didn't get any tension from his character. On the other hand, if you look at John Goodman's performance in Cloverfield Lane, right from the outset, there's a sense of implied menace. Like he was talking very politely and kindly, but at the same time, you never know what he's going to do. Whereas in the case of, as you said it, Dave Bautista shows up. He says, "Hi, I'm Dave Bautista. Here's what's going to happen," and then it happens.
Yeah, that's what I loved about it.
Yeah, okay.
It's like there was no playing around, and you know, everyone, like the people that were watching with me, they're like, "But it's like no," and it's like, why don't they just kill? No, these three have to come to a decision. These four cannot do anything but make them make that decision.
Okay, then let's talk about that. I found it super contrived, and at the point where there's that much detail, you don't get to hand wave, it's some divine providence thing. right? Let's even compare this to a previous work by Shyamalan, because I kind of enjoy Shyamalan. I think he's a competent filmmaker. I even enjoyed Signs, for crying out loud. I thought it was okay. I'm not going to endorse the theological perspective that it adopts, but I thought it was okay. But Signs as well was about faith in some sort of weird plan that you can't quite understand. This too was kind of sort of about that. But the plan was just very specific and incredibly arbitrary and never explained, and it's based entirely on faith of the narrative of Dave Bautista.
True. The final outcome, like how they delivered the message and how they sort of figure out these are the four blah 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 horsemen, and that was interesting. But then just the final thing, and then
the method with the four horsemen wasn't even set up well.
No, well, in a way, like how we explained it. This is anyway. Like I said, I don't want to spoil.
You're familiar with the sacrifice of Isaac, right?
No.
Okay, well, God comes to Abraham and says, to prove your love to me, you must kill your son. All right? And just before he's about to do it, God shows up and says, okay, you've demonstrated your faith. Go forth. I would put it, regardless of your thoughts on the sacrifice of Isaac, either in the context of a theological or from a narrative perspective, the story doesn't get better if Dave Bautista is the guy who says, by the way, God told me that you have to go kill your son. That doesn't make the story better. It makes it arbitrary and silly.
And there was other silly parts too, like if any of them showed any sort of evidence of these visions they had, they just sort of showed up.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't they bring the drawings or bring these things?
Yeah.
And see, look, I drew this when I was 4, and look, it's exactly like your cabin and all this thing.
You can't tell an interesting story about faith when it's that arbitrary. It's not based on values. It's not based on narrative. It's just based on the testimony of strangers, purely. And I don't know if he meant it to be a meditation on faith. Certainly not on religion. This was not a movie about religion, so that's fine. Which is good, because it would have been a terrible movie about religion. But as a meditation on faith, it's bankrupt, because if that's his vision of faith, that's not what faith looks like.
And
it's like faith is not a pro wrestler asking you just to believe some crazy thing because he says it. Like, that's not what it is.
And it's exactly like the killing at the end, where it's not explained. It's why is the killing of each horseman bring on a thing? Like, why does that happen?
Because it makes for a good scene. He wanted to film some violence.
Yes,
he thought that would increase the tension. The other thing that kind of disappointed me, and again, this is wanting the movie to be something else. This is kind of like a hypothetical scenario from the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. There's a bit in the Brothers Karamazov where they say, what if you could secure the perpetual peace and happiness of humankind, and all you had to do was torture to death some small innocent child? Would you be able to do it? And this is, I actually taught this to my students. It was one of the thought experiments, and it's a good way to capture it. And it's a good way to tell how consequentialist you are, how principled you are, how deontological you are. The only perspective that was ever articulated there were two perspectives. There was the implied perspective of the quote-unquote horseman, which was, well, we've got these visions that say this is how it's got to be. So that's absent principle, right? It's just a principle neutral position. They feel compelled, they're driven by some sort of higher purpose that they can see, and yet are consistently unable to communicate to the protagonists. And then there are the protagonists who just react with shock and horror, which is appropriate. The only actual substantive position that's articulated was by one of the two fathers, who says, I hate the rest of the world, so why would I bother sacrificing for them? Which is a perspective, and that's fine, but it doesn't really grapple with anything remotely resembling principle. And so I would have liked a little bit more substance there. It was mostly just, this is horrifying, I will not engage with it. Which is a fine reaction, but not necessarily lead to the most substantial movie. It was okay. Look, it was competently executed.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's the best movie of all time.
I just didn't feel the tension.
It just left me really wondering if am I enjoying this? Was this, it was just this weird. I watched it right to the end, and kept waiting for this like weird twist or hidden things in the background.
Sure.
Like, there was that one thing where there was a light in the background, and he said he saw a person, and so I thought maybe
I'll watch anything with Jonathan Groff. By the way, that man is weapons grade handsome.
It's true.
Anyway,
I was thinking maybe I missed something. Like maybe there was these hidden things happening throughout the whole movie. I wasn't sure what was going on. Anyway, it's definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, I will give him credit for Shyamalan for not resorting to his same bag of tricks. He's let us down so many times. It's competently. He's a workman-like. Sorry, workman-like. That's a gendered term. He's a competent director. He knows how to frame a scene, but normally he's good at building tension. And I just didn't feel it. And I think that every role that Dave Bautista has ever played would be better played by Vin Diesel.
I was about to say, you just have Vin Diesel jealousy. That
little Vin on the brain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's constant comparison. He can't live up, Mark. The bar is too high. Okay?
No, actually, the real problem is that Vin Diesel refuses to be in actual movies anymore. He just has no interest. Vin Diesel was classically trained. He's a theater actor. And he used to be in indie movies. So he's just not going to do that anymore. He just wants to be in movies where he's in big fights where he always wins. Which is, I can't blame him. If I could write contracts like that, I'd
I was about to say, if you can cherry pick what you play. Then,
yeah, exactly. Thank you, listeners, for joining us for Masterpiece Theater. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Did you know Nissan EVs have traveled 8 billion miles? Just a quick trip to Pluto and back. And what did we learn along the way? Well, that an EV can take on the world, like the Nissan Leaf. It can move racing forward and take your breath away, like the all-new Nissan Ariya. We learned to make EVs that electrify. 8 billion miles driven by Leaf owners globally since 2010. 2023 Ariya has limited availability. All-wheel drive expected availability early 2023, subject to change.
92% of households that join Peloton early in the year are still active a year later.
Yeah, if you like cycling to EDM.
Not just EDM. Try cycling to Broadway hits. Take a scenic hike in Iceland on our treadmill or row to some 80s jams.
Because I have so much free time.
Whether you have 30 minutes or just 5, Peloton can fit any schedule. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton tread, row, or bikes risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.